Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you to this event on EU sustainable growth. Well, today's event is jointly organized by Bruegel, the Austrian Ministry of Finance, and the Central Bank of Austria. And therefore, I would like to express my special thanks to our cooperation partners right at the outset. And I'm especially glad that we have our esteemed colleagues from Bruegel with us today. They will share all their perspectives from Brussels with us, which we greatly appreciate. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm also very delighted to welcome my predecessor, Gertrude Tumpel-Gugerell. She really has had an impressive career as a central banker and is therefore a great role model for so many, including myself. Not only was she the first female vice governor of the Central Bank of Austria, she was also the first and so far only person from Austria to serve on the ECB's executive board. Thank you very much, Gerti, for being here today. And last but not least, let me welcome Markus Materbauer, who will be here in a few minutes and who has been very well known in the Central Bank of Austria for many years and who is now, as we all know, of course, the Minister of Finance, and who is and always will be one of the country's leading macroeconomists. So we are looking forward to his words. Well, today, we will talk about sustainable growth, which lies precisely at the heart of the economic policy making in the European Union. And there is no doubt we need positive growth. We need positive growth to keep our living standards high and to keep employment in the Union robust. And of course, we want our growth to be sustainable, simply to extend its benefits to future generations. And it's perfectly clear we do not want to improve our living standard today at the expense of the living standards of our children or their children. And honestly, that is simply a question of intertemporal prudence and intergenerational fairness. Actually, we all know that economists and central bankers for quite a while relied on a rather narrow definition of sustainability. They mostly referred to the fiscal or financial sustainability of debt obligations. And therefore, they are asking questions like, is the government in a position to service its liabilities over a longer time period? Or will a bank still be solvent if the interest rate rises? Or can a firm redeem its bonds if the business cycle weakens? But I can say that we have broadened our perspective on sustainability over the past years. And indeed, we had to broaden it, because the existential challenges of our climate and our natural resources have become more and more obvious. And because it has become more and more obvious that these challenges are rooted in our economic system. So it's up to us to act now. It's up to us to act decisively. And the goal is a very clear one. Global temperatures should be kept within a range which is beneficial for human well-being. And of course, we therefore know that we need to change our modes of production and our modes of transport to make them sustainable. And these challenges will, of course, and changes will, of course, be very demanding without any doubt, not only for energy companies or car producers, but also for banks, because banks, they finance these changes. And these changes, therefore, also affect authorities that supervise and regulate these banks. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that we must respond appropriately to these challenges. That is why central banks around the world have founded the Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS. Within this network, we exchange methods and we exchange policy recommendations with the aim to cope with climate change-related risks to financial stability and inflation. Both the Central Bank of Austria and the Financial Market Authority are members of the NGFS. Actually, we all know that all policymakers strive for sustainable growth, which is why today's event seeks answers to a very fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, what is the right mix of structural, monetary, and fiscal instruments to achieve sustainable growth? And of course, we all know that fundamental questions are never easy to answer and that there are no simple solutions. Our monetary policy plays a crucial role, of course, in stabilizing prices and the macroeconomic environment. And this is key for long-term investments. But monetary policy alone cannot drive sustainable growth. We therefore need responsible partners in other areas of policy making. We need structural and fiscal instruments as well. Well, structural policies are the remit of national governments. They improve competitiveness, foster innovation, and ensure that our national economies become more adaptable. Actually, it's now a truism that we can hardly achieve growth without digital transformation, without education, and without cooperations of universities with industry. And finally, fiscal policy funds public investment in green infrastructure, in renewable energy, and in social cohesion. And these are, of course, as we are all well aware, essential for sustainable growth. Carbon taxes and other fiscal policy instruments can contribute to the objective of clean and green growth. And in addition to national budgets, the EU's Recovery and Resilience Facility provides financing too. So, still, the remaining question is, how do we best reconcile these policies? Because structural reforms must align with fiscal incentives and monetary conditions. And in addition, coordination of policies should encourage private investment, support employment, and foster a just transition. Therefore, again, the question still is, which policy mix ensures that no country and no generation is left behind? Well, to discuss this very important question, we have convened today's event, and I'm absolutely convinced we can expect some very stimulating insights. So once again, thank you all for coming and for contributing to what will hopefully be an engaging and insightful debate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can all look forward to what is coming up next, namely the keynote speech of Zsolt Darvas. He will discuss how these policy fields can support sustainable growth in different world regions, and he will also discuss what conclusions he draws from these observations for the European Union. Allow me to say a few words about Zsolt. Zsolt has been a senior fellow at Bruegel since 2013, before he worked among many other areas in central banking. So he is really well equipped to speak on the optimal policy mix. His expertise is in high demand, I may say. He has been repeatedly invited to testify in the European Parliament. Furthermore, among his publications are papers on a green fiscal pact for the European Union, or on the implications of fiscal policy decisions in a large EU member state on its smaller neighbors. So, Zsolt, again, thank you very much for coming and for contributing to our today's discussion. But, ladies and gentlemen, first things first, Jaromír Zettelmeier, who is the director of Bruegel, will speak briefly about his institute, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary in this year. And Jaromír, we here at the Central Bank of Austria have followed your work over these 20 years very closely, and we are very grateful for all the stimulating contributions to the policy debates of the European Union. So happy anniversary, Jaromír, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so Vice Governor Stifting, I'm incredibly honored to be here. I'm very happy about your warm words. So Austria has been always, and the National Bank, always at the very core of the Bruegel family. You have been with us from the beginning, and you have been really at the center of what drives Bruegel. And the theme of today's anniversary events reflects this. The problem with today's debates about economic policy is that the tone, the shrillness of the policy debate, in a way is reflective of the enormity of the challenges that Europe faces, which, in my view, are the biggest challenges since World War II. And so, there's clear that something will need to change. We cannot do business as usual. But this also produces a slightly febrile atmosphere where basic economic principles are sometimes thrown overboard. And particularly at the center of Europe, where we are often thinking of framework conditions as essential for driving prosperity, this poses a problem because we do not really have strong guidance on how and to what extent and in what ways to deviate from the type of economic orthodoxy that has, for the most part, served Europe very well since World War II, without getting down the slippery slope. And so what we really need, I think, is a very open discussion along the lines of the topic as you have formulated it, that refocuses on the objective, right? The objective is sustainable growth, or as economists would call it, welfare, and, you know, looks at a very wide range of structural, monetary, and fiscal instruments, which is our complete toolkit, without necessarily running off into a fashionable corner immediately. So, in other words, what we need in this debate is some judicious combination of principle and pragmatism and innovation, and there's no country to do that like Austria, because that's basically your brand, right? I mean, Austrian policymaking is supposed to be a more pragmatic version of the German variant, and it is that dose of pragmatism that we need now without abandoning the principles. And I'm hopeful that this will come through in the discussions that are to follow. Okay, but in the meantime, and I do not want to get into substance yet, I'm just very grateful that we can here be with you. You have already treated us very well. We have an incredibly high-powered panel later. I think this may be the first anniversary event where we have both the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Central Bank on the key policy panel, so I'm extremely honored to be here, and I really look forward to the discussions. Thank you again, Vice Governor.
So let me also start by thanking, first of all, for the invitation, and for Vice Governor Stiffinger for the very kind and nice introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here, and also, I mean, a fantastic opportunity to share some thoughts with you ahead of a really fantastic panel with Governor Kochner, Finance Minister Martin Bauer, and Director Zettelmeier. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So I took the title of this event as the core of my speech. So I will speak about how to coordinate and what roles could monetary, fiscal, and structural policies play in fostering sustainable growth. So I wonder if I could have my slides. But I think then let me just try to clarify what is meant by sustainable growth, because different people, also different institutions, mean by different things by that. One definition I very much like is the definition of the World Bank, which suggests that it should be efficient, clean, and resilient. Efficient in a sense of efficient use of natural resources, clean in a sense of minimizing pollution and destruction of the environment, and resilient in a sense of being sufficiently robust to adverse climate events, and also at the same time contributing to reducing the likelihood of such climate events. The EU is indeed striving for sustainable growth, but I would also add, just as an initial remark, also inclusive and sustainable and dynamic growth. I would also like to emphasize the importance of inclusivity, because when we look at the growth performance of the EU, we very often find, unfortunately, that Europe lags behind in many aspects. But if we focus more on the social side, then we can bring many positive results and many positive findings. For example, in the EU and the US, life expectancy was nearly the same about 15 or 20 years ago. Now, Europe is 7 years ahead of the US. Also, if you look at healthy the healthy time spent in retirement, or we look at inequality and other social indicators, clearly there are major problems within the European Union, but I think there are also some achievements. And some of the first slides, which they come, I will also try to deliver some positive messages. But before that, let me just try to highlight what I will speak about today. So I will start with a brief comparison of the European Union, the United States, and China in terms of sustainable growth. And then I will review evidence, both for monetary, fiscal, and structural policies. Maybe I should press a button. Oh, wonderful. It was so simple. Okay. So I will also, I will basically review what the literature says and use illustrations to illustrate a couple of key points. Now, probably you know many things that I will speak about, so I will be fast on those points, but I also hope to show you some charts and arguments which might be interesting. Okay, so let me start. So, Jeremy just talked about the slippery curve on which Europe is at the moment. I would like to nuance this a little bit. In fact, we have joint work with Jeremy and Marie-Sophie Lappe from Bruegel, in which we will, hopefully in a few weeks or months, we will publish that, in which we look at how to measure growth performance and productivity performance across different countries, and in particular, how to compare the European Union to the United States. So the numbers I brought here are the only number from the IMF World Economic Outlook for the European Union, and it shows what was the share in world GDP of total output of EU, US, and China, and obviously China is skyrocketing. EU and US is falling back. But if you look at the dynamics of EU and US, yes, the EU is falling back somewhat more, but it's not as dramatic as sometimes portrayed. Now, importantly, this data is measured at current price purchasing power parities. If you would use constant price purchasing power parities, then the difference would be starker. Nevertheless, I think a good news is that at least at current price purchasing power parity, the slippery or the falling back of the European Union is not as dramatic as often thought. And the next three charts will really show good results. So maybe many of you know, but I think it's worth to show what is the carbon intensity of output. Now it's falling everywhere in worldwide. But Europe had the lowest level in 1995, which is a starting year of this chart, and continues to have the lowest level. It's also going down in the US and China. Now, when I saw such charts, I always wondered whether energy price levels can play a role, because we all know that energy prices has been higher in the European Union than in the US and China. And for example, what we saw during in 2022 energy price hike is that suddenly households and also corporates could reduce their gas consumption almost by a quarter as prices skyrocketed. And indeed, there is some evidence that indeed higher energy prices foster energy efficiency. There's evidence using the literature was uses microdata like patenting and focusing on specific sectors, and also more macro data lead to such results. So indeed, a major problem of European industry and also households is high energy prices. But at the same time, we must also acknowledge that this is a key driving force for change, both incentivizing households and corporations to become more energy efficient. Now, this chart showed CO2 emissions per total output. The next shows per capita, which is completely different. Again, the United States is the most pollutive, at least among the three major areas. China is also growing. Europe started from a lower level, and there was some decline. Still, Europe is 2.5 times better than the United States. The United States emission per population is 2.5 times better. And finally, a chart on productivity in which the Europe is better than the US. This is called so-called the CO2 productivity. The OECD has a nice green growth indicators data sets, and this is one of their indicators. So it shows how much GDP is produced per 1 unit of energy-related CO2 emissions. And yeah, there's an improvement everywhere. That's very nice. But interestingly, Europe not just leading in terms of levels, but also the improvements over the past 30 years have been the strongest, both in absolute terms, and also Europe had the fastest growth than the United States. So overall, with these introducing charts, I dare to draw the conclusion that in terms of sustainable growth, Europe at least ranks better than the US and China. Now, obviously, we can never be complacent and satisfied, and there's a lot to do, but at least some positive news are good to share. And now policies. So it's about monetary, fiscal, and structural policies, the main theme of this conference. So I will start with monetary policy, because in a sense, this is the easiest for two reasons. First, I think there is a broader consensus, although I will show that the Fed has completely different view on its role in climate change than the European Central Bank, but at least in terms of monetary policy, there's broader consensus. And also, monetary policy decision-making is much, much efficient than decision-making in finance ministries or governments implementing structural reforms, because the board comes together, board decision is supported by high-quality research materials produced by the bank staff. Excellent economists are everywhere in Frankfurt, everywhere in Europe. And the board decides, next day they start to implement, so it's very, very easy. It's so much more difficult to change course in fiscal policy, and not to mention on structural policies. So let me just go through them, and obviously country-specific factors should not be forgotten. Each country is unique in a sense. So I will just have 3 slides on monetary policy. The first one recalls some theories. So again, it's what monetary policy can do depends on what conceptual framework we adopt. Now, obviously, in the classical quantitative theory of money and related, money was completely neutral, and only real factors could drive growth. Now, in the Keynesian and monetarist view, at least there is a short-run non-neutrality. The monetary policy can have an impact on stabilizing aggregate demand, and therefore contribute at least to reducing short-term fluctuations. But there are also some models which introduces monetary policy to endogenous growth. And in these models still, the core fundamentals like human capital or research and development and innovation drive long-term growth. But monetary policy can have an impact on these drivers. For example, if it can influence innovation or R&D, either in general or in green, for example, via market development, better financial markets, or even interest rate and some credit policies, then indirectly even monetary policies could have a more longer-term impact on growth. And obviously the inflation, the main mandate of all central banks, at least in Western nations, on inflation, I think there's a broad consensus that zero inflation is not optimal. A moderate level of inflation is needed to support growth, but high inflation is clearly a risk for that. Now, the second on monetary policy. So what can monetary policy do for for green growth. Again, it is very well recognized everywhere that climate change has already having and will have a major impact on monetary policy making, basically through affecting transmission channels, inflation, both volatile and possible inflation shocks, and also financial stability via influencing corporations and banks that lend to corporations. There's a very vivid literature on how monetary policy could, in principle, support green growth, and lots of tools are listed here, at least 5 main topics. Obviously, one is green asset purchases, so trying to purchase whenever the central bank purchases assets of companies or even governments that are greener, tilting the portfolio could have some possibly small benefits for such companies. Another one is green long-term refinancing operations. This has not been done, at least in Europe. I was also among the one who called that in some of my earlier work. I mean, the rationale is that since climate change does have an impact on the monetary policy's primary mandate, if it can have a tool which can foster the limit reducing climate risks, that can also help its primary mandate. The third one is the collateral framework. In particular, one of our colleagues, Dirk Schumacher, made a quite interesting research in this area. He also did some simulations. So in the collateral framework, what the central bank can do is to increase eligibility for green companies or projects, and also reduce the haircut, for example, for such companies. And he made some calculations which in a medium-term scenario suggested that the ECB portfolio the CO2 component of ECB portfolio could be reduced by almost 1/2 just by changing the collateral framework. Again, supporting green bond market development is also a tool that the central bank can do. And then, very importantly, integrating climate risk into forecasting and communication, raising awareness of the general public of the importance of the issue is also absolutely crucial. And the last slide on monetary policy is practice, which is very interesting. So if you compare the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the Bank of China, they have completely different approaches. So the Federal Reserve acknowledges, obviously, everybody now acknowledges that climate change has a major risk for financial stability, and it has tools to monitoring and supporting the resilience of the US financial system. But it completely refuses to play as a kind of climate policymaker. As Jerome Powell said, the Fed will not be a climate policymaker. And they have a number of reasons for that. One is that the Fed mandate it doesn't include a secondary one, so it's a bit broader because it includes both inflation and output, but there is no secondary mandate to support the general policy of the government. They also have a view that monetary policy can do very little for climate change, so it's a really marginal effect that it could have, so why bothering with that? And also fear that once they start to move away from the classical objective of the central bank, then it might invite various criticism and possibly politicization. Why doing this and not that? So it would make it much more difficult for the FOMC committee to make decisions. Now the ECB has a mixed approach, so one focusing on risk, but also has some support. The ECB also has a climate strategy, including greening the portfolio. But as I checked the literature, and some papers are cited here, they argue that this process is way too low, way too slow, and urges the ECB to accelerate its efforts. I would be eager to hear the panel discussion, what's the view here on whether the ECB is progressing at the right speed or maybe not. And the Bank of China, People's Bank of China, is the most active in terms of green finance. So it's not just doing risk management, but also some programs for financing low carbon projects. They also introduced a green taxonomy and aligned it with the EU. Also, green bonds has a special status as collateral, and there is some research finding that it has reduced the yield on green bonds compared to non-green bonds. And they also have a so-called window guidance procedure in which they encourage financial institutions to expand credit to such green activities. So to sum up, so certainly monetary policy, as I said, I think there's the most consensus among the three policy areas. I think there is merit in the endogenous growth literature suggesting that monetary policy can, if it indirectly can influence the pace of innovation, then it might also contribute to longer-term growth. Now, on terms of greening and the role in sustainable growth, I'm a bit more on the skeptical side, so more on the US side, but nevertheless, every little help matters. So I still very much welcome the ECB for taking climate change on some of its secondary targets. Okay, so fiscal. I have more slides on fiscal, and as I see the time is already running, so I will need to skip some of the slides, I'm afraid. Again, starting a little bit with theories, to some extent it's parallel with what I said about monetary policy. Again, so if you are in the endogenous growth framework, then indeed fiscal policy can have a permanent effect on overall growth, particularly by improving human capital, fostering innovation, and also productive public investment, which can create framework conditions for growth. There are very general design principles for tax policy, public expenditure, budget disciplines, but maybe I would skip that because I think that is very well known, everyone who ever comes to a central bank. Let me just come to some short charts. So I talked about productive public spending, which is a very nice concept. Now, if you want to measure it, then obviously we have to make choices. So what we did is that we used, again, some classical works like Barrow and Salai Martin, and classified productive expenditures as those which have a direct influence on either physical or human capital development. And unproductive spending is social protections, defense, public order, culture, and things like that. And then if we compare the EU, US, and China, and I would like to emphasize that this is for the general government in the US, so not just the federal, but the general, then you can see that basically the productive spending is almost the same as a share of GDP. China is marginally below, but in the EU and the US, it's hardly distinguishable. What is clearly bigger for the EU is the non-productive and mostly the social protection. Again, perhaps that's not that surprising, but again, finding that EU and the US spend almost the same share of GDP on productive investment, again, highlights some of the works which I just quickly ran through on the previous slide. Maybe the last point is that spending smarter, so how do we spend, is obviously much more important than spending more. Another layer of fiscal policy is how such productive spending, including public investment, is preserved during a crisis. And here we report a chart, which again might have been well known by many of you. So this chart shows the 27 current European Union countries. On the horizontal axis, you can see fiscal adjustment from 2008 to 2013, and on the vertical axis, you can see how public investment as a share of GDP changed during the same period. I highlighted Austria with red color so that you can easily identify your country. And there's clearly a very clear association. I mean, you might know that I'm Hungarian by nationality, so Hungary is a clear exception, which able to somehow increase public investment during fiscal adjustment, maybe because public investment was already at a low level at that time. But there's a very, very clear association that, at least in the past, public investment is a major victim of fiscal adjustment. Now the question answered by the next, not answered, but hinted by the next slide, so I come there, but the future would look like. As you all know, the European Union introduced new fiscal rules April last year. And one of the goals of the rules was to not just preserve, but also foster public investment. And what this chart shows is the intention included in the plans themselves. So on the horizontal axis, you can see what fiscal adjustment is planned from 2024 to 2028. And the vertical axis, you can see what is the plan changed in the public investment per GDP ratio over the same period. Now, you also see here a downward sloping curve, but there is much more volatility, much more variation. And important, there are a couple of countries, and Austria is among those, which plans to increase public investment despite fiscal consolidation. So it's a very noble effort to do that, but also France is also planning to do that, and obviously Germany, Bulgaria, Portugal as well. Now, we need to see what obviously will be the outcome, because countries can basically propose anything. The new fiscal rules will only look at one indicator, the net expenditure growth. If that is met, then each country will have to report annual progress reports on how they implement the plan. But if they report, sorry, our investment falls short of our plan, then the Commission will say we are also sorry, but nothing will happen. So we need to see what will actually happen. But unfortunately, I do see a risk that investment will likely disappoint. And also, if you combine all these countries, the implied overall increase in EU public investment over this 4-year period is just 0.25%, so 0.25%, and almost large share of that is due to Germany itself. For the aggregate of the other countries is very, very close to zero. But this means that even in the plans which countries put forward, there is no major investment boost. I mean, we all talk about the Draghi report, and I know it will also be the topic of the next panel discussion. Draghi identified a major investment gap in the EU. He said that obviously most of that should be implemented by the private sector. But he also said that the public sector share is between 20 and 50%, so can be also 1/2 in some specific investments. And simply we don't see in national fiscal plans that countries plan to do that. So I do see a major risk that unfortunately Europe will seriously short of those plans. Okay, time is running. So carbon pricing is obviously a very important tool. Again, let me recall a Bruegel work, which we are very proud of. I think it was made in 2008 or 2009 by Philippe Agnon, who just received a Nobel Prize in Economics, and Reinhilde Wugelers. We just issued it recently, in which they argued that there should be, the title was No Green Growth Without Innovation, or something like that. And they argued that there should be carbon pricing, but also it should be combined by green subsidies. So let me show you some chart on that. The first is how much fossil fuel support is provided, again, in the EU, China, and US. Now, in the EU, we saw this big shoot up in 2022 due to the energy crisis, as we all know. Unfortunately, there's no more recent data than 2022. But even before 2022, EU had far the largest, almost 0.5% of GDP, of fossil fuel support. It includes both consumer and producer supports, as measured by the OECD. So clearly, we want green growth. as I said, we are doing well on Greece, but still we heavily subsidize fossil fuels. And the next one is the ETS revenues, emission trading system revenues. Again, the left panel compares China, US, and the EU. Now you probably know a lot about EU ETS. In the US and China, or in the US, there are some ETS at the state level. And on the right panel, you can see, for example, California singled out. And in some years, it had revenue similar to the EU. And there are also 9 other US states. Almost all of them are democratic states, and 2 of them are swing states, which have ETS. So again, the US is at the region level, and overall is much less. Now, also in China, on the left panel, you might see some red spots at the but they're very extremely small, because China has both some regionals, and this is revenue from the regional. They also have a national one, but the national one, all allowances are free at the moment, so that they don't generate revenues. It might do later, and I do think it will come. So again, just concluding, the EU has somewhat, ambivalent approach, because at the same time we support a lot, fossil fuel activities, and on the other hand we also raise at least much larger revenues from emission trading than these other 2 main competitors. And let me go to the structural one. So, because almost the time is over, I think the structural components of growth and green growth is far the most complicated, and also far the most difficult to act on. Because, again, what is listed here, like institutions, property right, contract enforcement, state capacity, and so on, government quality in more general, I think it's very well recognized that this is crucial for growth in general. Human capital, competition, innovation, and so on, financial development are absolutely crucial. So I think there's a good understanding, at least between economists, but somehow these very basic things don't get into policy making in most countries. Again, for example, we just discussed at lunch, but also last week in Rome, we discussed the cases of some Nordic countries like Denmark, Sweden, but also Netherlands. So if you look at these countries, they were somehow able to match the US in many aspects. So they have, first of all, the productivity level is at very, very high level. The private research and development spending is again similar to the US level and much above the EU average. They have very deep capital markets. They have some very successful companies which could become global companies, even though these are very, very small countries, small markets. If you look at any indicator of human capital, government effectiveness, they rank in the top in the world. So even some EU countries found the magic to do this, but others don't find. And yeah, again, we can discuss why this is the case, but at least I think the example of these Nordic countries and Netherlands suggests that it's not impossible to do good policies in the EU. Okay, I'm well over time, so yeah, let me show you this chart, which again, this is a model-based exercise prepared by commission authors, published in a journal, which shows that what would be the impact on long-term level of output if in various structure indicators, which are listed in the bottom, includes product market competition, regulation, revenue neutral tax shifts, labor market reform, human capital investment, and innovation policies. So they use about 20 specific indicators for these fields. They identify which are the 3 best performers in the EU, and for each country, they look at what would the growth impact if they would close just half of the gap of these quantitative indicators. And at the average of the EU, in the long run, it's about 20%, so very, very dramatic. Obviously, reforms take time, so it can't be implemented immediately. But even after 20 years, the impact would be, around, 10% on average. Now, the biggest one in Romania, Italy, and Greece, maybe not surprising. The smallest one in Sweden, Estonia, Finland, Netherlands, and Denmark, obviously because these countries often among the top 3 of all of these indicators, so they have little additional scope for improvement. But for many countries, and also Austria is here, somewhere in the middle of the field, there will be huge potential to improve. But these reforms should be implemented, but they are not implemented. So let me finish with some European semester lessons. So as we look through, again, as probably all of you know, there is an annual process of policy coordination in the EU, which ends in each summer by country-specific recommendations proposed by the Commission but approved by the Council, and they basically look at various aspects of economic domain, and many of them which are, in fact, perhaps all of them are relevant for growth. Some of them are also relevant for sustainable growth. And here in this chart, I just showed a few specific areas beyond the total: energy and climate, business, labor, and taxation. And again, the scores between 0 and 1, I put on the right scale the qualitative labels provided by the Commission. So if you look at basically for all of these more difficult reforms, the average performance is between limited progress and some progress. Maybe in taxation, it's very limited progress. It's much closer to that. Maybe in improving the business environment, it's about halfway. But overall, countries are relatively slow to implement. And here I specifically singled out Austria, since we are here. So I looked at, again, there are many such recommendations, but here I focus those which are more related to sustainable growth. So the first column looks at what recommendation was made in 2024. The second column, what was the assessment this year. And the last one, whether the same recommendation is made in this year. And there is one with substantial progress, diversifying away from Russian gas supply. So it seems that some progress has been made. And this proposal has been not repeated this year. But others, like, reduce emissions, in particular in the transport sector, promote business dynamism, creation and growth of young companies, including through better access to risk capital, boosting the labor market participation of women, improve the tax mix to reduce the high tax wedge on labor, and support inclusive and sustainable growth more generally. These were all ranked as some progress. Again, there's a detailed assessment of the Commission, and everything was made again this year. So the same recommendation was made this year. So some progress has been made, but not substantial progress. So again, I think, for example, reducing the high tax wedge on labor, I think that's a very basic taxation policy that is one of the most distortive taxes that a government could apply, and it seems to be that the progress is too slow on that. Okay, so my time is over, so I wouldn't go to the Draghi letter issues, also because it will be partly discussed in the following panel. So just let me maybe summarize 5 main takeaways. So first is that the EU outperforms US and China in terms of key sustainable growth indicators, and I think this is a good news. We should appreciate. It should not make us complacent, but at least we should appreciate. I do think that the mainstream views on the roles of monetary, fiscal, and structural policies remain valid, even if we take the more recent economic security concerns. Again, cutting the red tape, improving the business environment, fostering capital markets for better funding of the companies, or reducing the high tax on labor. I think these are such basic things which remain important. There's very significant growth potential in smarter public spending and stronger structural frameworks. Yet, again, fiscal policy and structural policy doesn't work like monetary policy, that a bunch of people come together, make a decision, and next day they implement, but it's much more complicated to implement at the national level. There's a major risk that public investment will contribute too little to the major gaps included in the Draghi report, which aims to foster sustainable growth. And again, the question, mostly for the panel, whether they will the European agenda of Draghi and Letta will be implemented, and parallel to that, whether it will also lead a simultaneous improvement also in national framework conditions for sustainable growth. So I'm sorry for being longer than I should have been, but I thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any comment or question, if there's still time, I would be happy to answer. Thank you. In principle, the coffee break has already started 5 minutes ago, but it's up to the organizers. But I still see a couple of hands. Ooh, quite many. So I'm asking whether is it possible to take some questions now or, okay, super.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My name is Kurt Bayer. I used to work at the Ministry of Finance. Thanks for the very competent rundown of what actually happens and doesn't happen. But given the state of affairs in the EU economy, on the climate and environment situation, but also on the social polarization, I'm just wondering whether the agenda that you have outlined here is bold enough. And I think Jeromin said we have to be bolder, we shouldn't do business as usual, we need more and further thinking. And I'm just wondering whether the initial tenet of Mrs. Stiftinger, that we all support growth as the major economic policy target, is really something we shouldn't also challenge. We know that in the EU, the fertility rates are 1.4%, much less than the 2.1% per woman you need to stabilize population. And we know that in some of the instruments which we have had to increase essentially labor productivity, we are reaching some kind of social limits or so. And I mean, there's another issue. Many countries say, okay, Europe has falling participation, has falling labor force and population, and we can supplement that with immigration. And we know that immigration causes a lot of problems in many countries. So maybe we could have the thought experiment to really go away and accept the fact that in the medium run, Europe will have stagnant or maybe even falling labor forces, and also falling and smaller GDPs. And maybe we should adjust towards that. Very difficult policy questions, obviously, but my question is really, should we really keep maintaining growth, even if it is sustainable growth? Thanks.
Maybe I suggest you collect the questions, and I answer in one go.
Yes, your statement that the European Union outperforms the US contradicts the numbers published by the World Bank on PPP adjusted BIP per capita. How did you get to these numbers?
Okay. Fabio Umra from ÖNB. Just maybe a remark rather than a question. So on the relationship between climate change and monetary policy, you mentioned that the ECB monetary policy or the climate change is related to the secondary mandate of the ECB. I have to admit that there is a debate within the Euro system taking place, whether it's a secondary or it's a primary goal. And I think those are winning out who think that it's related to the primary goal. There is a lot of literature that shows that inflation is affected by climate change in the short run, by natural disasters, by droughts, by floodings, but also in the medium run, transition policies can affect inflation. So climate change is directly related to our target variable. In that sense, many policymakers in the Euro system think that the climate change is related to the primary objective, and we should take it seriously, which is done internally, for instance, by tilting the monetary policy portfolio towards green bonds and so on. So that's maybe a new finding that you could take on board in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela Köppel, former Austrian Institute of Economic Research. Thanks for your presentation and the interesting indicators you presented, and your conclusion that the EU is outperforming the US and China. I was thinking about, from my point of view, an important indicator you didn't show, and which is more future-oriented, which is expenditure on research and development, where definitely the EU is facing serious competition from China, and especially being more future-oriented, this probably is one of the important developments we can see.
Jürgen Janger, also from the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. Just a very brief question. You mentioned that the public investment capacity of the EU member countries is limited. That's exactly why we are seeing the proposals also from Draghi on a joint EU financing instrument. What do you think about this as a potential way to invest in the future, as my colleague mentioned?
Thank you. One question you didn't mention, the single market, which is a problem because it's not really sufficient, and where is big firms are segmenting the single market, which with higher prices, especially in small countries like Austria. We had a discussion on this. Shouldn't we have a single market which would be a real growth driver, as the IMF has shown? The tariff equivalent is 45% in the now existing single market. This would be one of its biggest growth drivers. Second question, financing for investment. Shouldn't we not only consider budgets, but also out of a budget stuff? We in Austria, we had a problem. We had in '95, we had to bring our budget deficit down to qualify for EMU. So we did the investments outside of a budget with the ASFINAG model, with the state guarantee, and it was quite successful. ASFINAG is now paying huge dividends to the Republic. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned the use of energy is more productive in Europe, but a major concern is the price level of energy in Europe. What can be done at the European level to improve also the price structure?
So, okay, so thank you so much for all these excellent questions and comments. So I think it's good that I answer in one go, because many of them are related. For example, for the very first question, whether what I put forward is bold enough, it's also very much related to the last question on what to do with the level of energy prices. So I think what I put in the presentation is super bold, if I can say that way. Because I see basically two things. One, I had some time to explain, namely that the fundamental framework conditions in many European countries are very, very poor. If you could near what Scandinavia is doing, we would fly with high growth and a very sustainable economy. And the second one, which I didn't have time to spend, is I very much endorse several ideas of the Draghi-Letta vision, which includes a single market. Also, Draghi put his focus on the high energy prices, and some of his suggestions I think is well made. For example, decoupling electricity prices from gas prices is the Commission is already working on that. Draghi also suggested completing the energy single market, building more interconnection across countries. Again, our energy team suggested this would be absolutely fundamental for increasing energy efficiency, also reducing volatility and also reducing prices. So I think what I put forward is very, very bold. I want big measures both at the national level and very important pan-European initiatives to improve the functioning of the single market. Now, perhaps there was a misunderstanding. I didn't say that the EU outperformed the US in per capita output. What I said, let me go back, is that it outperforms in sustainable growth. For example, it shows this chart, GDP per unit of energy-related CO2 emissions. So this is called carbon productivity. So in this, clearly the EU outperforms the US and its lead has improved. In the paper I mentioned, we write with Jeromin and Marie-Sophie, we will also compare per capita and per hours worked. So just in a nutshell, so if you look at current prices, the EU is somewhat doing better. And in 2024, why would you use 2010 prices to compare per hours output? And if you use that, you do find that in many countries like Netherlands, also Belgium, Denmark, not to mention Ireland and Luxembourg, they are special, but a couple of countries are even more productive than the United States. But the big issue, or a very interesting issue, is that if you look at constant prices, then the development was, or the EU gap has increased. So in this paper, we will explore what are the reasons behind these possible differences in constant prices and current prices. But again, if you're interested in what is the productivity level of any country in 2024 relative to the US, you should use 2024 prices. And Denmark, Netherlands, and Belgium are outperforming the US. But I didn't say that the EU as a whole outperforms. Now, on Fabian, on whether climate is a primary or secondary mandate, I think it's a nice comment. I think I do share the point that climate change has a major impact on inflation. But then let me ask a question back to you. So then, why the Federal Reserve doesn't care at all? So why they say that they look about the risk in the financial sector and they want to minimize the possible disruptions that could do. But still, as I said, I think the central bank can contribute little to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but every little help matters. So I very much welcome the ECB's ambitions, and I would be even happier if it would be upgraded to the primary goal from the secondary goal. Now, the question on the research and development expenditures, the EU is falling behind both the US and China. Again, for the whole of the EU, this is true. But again, if you look at Sweden and Denmark, this is not true. So again, some countries could find the local ingredients to do that. Again, we also earlier this lunch we had a discussion what could have been the secret behind that. Partly history, partly a very efficient domestic policy making process. But some countries could create very deep capital markets, also most likely private pension savings which exceed 100% of GDP there, created lots of local capital that local companies could rely on. Also, they have so much, so they invest most of it abroad, but still local companies do have access. Also, local people invest a lot in the capital market, so they don't earn just zero return on their bank deposits as most German savers, but also benefit from higher returns. So some countries could do that, and in order to reach that, it will not be overnight, because the public R&D is broadly similar. But what we really lack in many countries is private R&D spending. And for that, again, the best thing I can imagine is improving framework conditions and also improving the single market, which, as I said, I very much endorse. There was a question about Draghi suggesting joint borrowing for an investment fund. I'm fully in line with that. I see he's a little bit, seems to be, not giving too much attention to that anymore. But I think that really would be the right way. So again, we had a recent report on the EU multi-annual financial framework, in which we dig deeper into the Draghi report and also other reports suggesting that there are missing investments and missing public spending, and we clarified item by item what would be public and private sector, and within the public sector, what would be sensible to do at a European level because they have a European dimension, either because they can be done more efficiently or they have cross-border implications, either creating positive externalities or limiting negative externalities. And we did find that indeed it would be about 0.8% of GDP extra spending on investment at the EU level, and the new EU budget wouldn't deliver that. It delivered a bit because cohesion and agriculture spending are proposed to be reduced by the Commission. The competitiveness is increased a little bit, but it would just marginally increase. So I do think there would be a strong case for more EU spending. And since these are investment, there's also a clear case for financing it by borrowing. But in some countries, I don't know where Austria stands at the moment. In the past, I know Austria was among the frugal group. I don't know whether it is still the case, because but I don't know. But certainly some countries clearly resist any additional borrowing by the European Union, but I very much endorse. Again, on the single market, I'm a bit critical about this IMF estimate of a 45% tariff rate, but the main intention of the paper, I think, is indeed right. Especially on the services, the single market is extremely fragmented, and there would be a clear case for doing that. But why it is not happening? The Commission always proposes completing the single market, but countries don't want that. So, countries could agree, okay, we design binding regulations on how certain segments of the single market should be fully harmonized with fully harmonized rules, but they don't do that. They instead agree on directives, services directive, whatever directive, which gives lots of national freedom to how to transpose it into national budgets. Some countries transpose it in a way which fosters cross-border activities, other transpose it in a way which hinders cross-border activities. So I think it's mostly the willingness of member states to complete the single market, which is the major issue. But I 100% agree that it should be a top priority, and I hope sooner or later politicians and policymakers will recognize that. Thank you very much.
There are still some minutes left for our coffee break.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion. First, I would like to introduce the panel members. Jeremy Zettelmeier, Director at Bruegel since September 22, and a very successful director, if I may say so. He graduated at the University of Bonn and holds a PhD from MIT. He worked at the IMF, the Peterson Institute, German Ministry of Economics, and the EBRD, and he has published widely. Our host of this afternoon, Governor Kocher, many thanks that you are enabling this event. He graduated at the University of Innsbruck, specialized in behavioral economics, and was professor of the LMU in Munich, and now at the University of Vienna. He was director of the Institute for Advanced Studies for 5 years, very successfully, our major postgraduate institute in Austria. The last 4 years, he served as Minister for Labor first and then for Labor and Economics. And since 2 months, he's the governor of the central bank and member of the governing council of the ECB. Markus Matterbauer, our Minister of Finance since 8 months. And despite an unpopular consolidation effort he has to undertake, he is now the most popular minister in the government. He graduated at the University of Economics in Vienna, worked at the university, at the Economic Research Institute, and for 15 years he was responsible for research at the Austrian Chamber of Labor. He was always very vocal on fiscal policy matters, and now he has to implement what he was always asking for. Chairman, our topic was introduced already this afternoon. I think a number of interesting questions have arisen, especially why there is only half-hearted progress on the Draghi agenda, why there is always, let's say, I would say, difficult conditions for our structural improvements, like higher energy costs and still insufficient investment in innovation and still insufficient market for risk capital. I'm sure you will touch upon these issues, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. So as I said in my introductory remarks before, I'm incredibly honored to be here. I'm super honored to be on the podium with both the central bank governor and the Minister of Finance. I don't think this has ever happened to me in my life. And perhaps most importantly, with Gertrude is the chair. So what you have to understand is that Gertrude is also the chair of Bruegel's review task force, an exercise that happens every 3 years. And so she will actually give me a grade, and the report is not out yet. So
it's ready, and it's ready. It's very, very good.
So I see it as a good sign, what she said before. Maybe otherwise she would have refused to be the chair on this panel. Okay, so we have a certain division of labor in this panel. I'm supposed to say something about the EU-level structural agenda, the structural reform agenda, and as we discussed, Gertrude encouraged me to put this a little bit into historical perspective. So I'm going to basically touch on a maximum of 4 points and a minimum of 2. So it depends on how fast we get. I can leave the other 2 for the discussion. So the first point is, how has the Brussels agenda changed, particularly with this von der Leyen Commission versus the previous one? Then I'm going to make a few remarks about the nature of the agenda, of the substance, so some problems with the new agenda. Maybe I will say at some point how we could do better, and finally maybe speculate on what we will see. So, you know, from normative to positive. Okay, so on the first 2 points, how has the Brussels agenda changed? So it has changed in 2 ways. If you think about where we stood about 5 years ago, we were in crisis fighting mode with COVID. We then went into crisis fighting mode on the energy crisis. So much of the von der Leyen I agenda was about crisis fighting. Now we are back in a more structural agenda, even though in some sense we are in an even deeper crisis than before, but it is a crisis of structural transformation. So it is appropriate to emphasize the structural points more. But then the other sense in which it has changed is that if you look at the part of the previous agenda, which was not about crisis fighting, which was essentially deliberately structural, it has shifted from, I would say, an objective to refine the EU or modernize the EU regulatory corpus within the traditional paradigm, which is essentially a liberal economic order both in the EU and internationally, to shifting challenges, mostly about, where we think of ourselves relative to the rest of the world. So in practice, what we mostly did in von der Leyen I was regulation to promote the Green Deal. So that was clearly the big agenda of the first von der Leyen administration, but also to modernize regulation on digital and competition and safety of the digital economy. So the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Beginning AI Act, and we had the reform of the fiscal rules. And, for the most part, this was good legislation, I think. Not all of it was good. Some of it was rushed, but for the most part, I think it tried to address a perceived need in a way that thought mostly about the consequences a bit more than the unintended consequences, right? So this was on the assumption that, the growth agenda was fundamentally fine, and so what we really needed is change the nature of growth in light of green objectives and technical changes. Now, the Draghi agenda, I think, which determines von der Leyen II, it changes the picture in two ways. First, there's much greater emphasis on productivity growth as the primary objective. And so that involves, in particular, a new single market push, particularly on capital markets union and energy markets. We will talk later about whether this is successful or not. So far, not very successful. And second, the emphasis is now on deregulation, and particularly some quick deregulation attempts, the so-called omnibus bills. But then the second big change is that we are shifting away from the liberal paradigm, if you want to call it like that. So essentially, open borders, trade integration, level playing field, towards some dose of EU-level economic nationalism. This is something that started at the end of the previous von der Leyen Commission, in reaction at that time to economic nationalism in the United States and China, as it started emerging even under the Biden administration, right? So there was the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which was a bit of a shock for Europeans because it involved, throwing massive subsidies at clean tech. We wanted to be the leaders in clean tech. We thought we could do it without massive subsidies. The US very radically changed approach. They also went very heavily in subsidizing chips. Then there was the issue of dependencies towards China, which we tried to address using something called the Critical Raw Materials Act. All these elements which already emerged at the end of the previous agenda have been, in a sense, magnified in the more recent developments. And so particularly the Draghi report goes further than these things in two respects. First, there was a call in the Draghi report for local content requirements to support EU tech, something we had criticized about the Biden administration, but we were now supposed to do ourselves. And then second, there is a very strong call to, in effect, subsidize energy-intensive industry conditional on decarbonization efforts. Now, this is mainly framed as part of the green agenda. So the idea is that some sectors are harder to abate than others, and you cannot do it without help from the state. But it's pretty clear that this also doubles as protection from from Chinese competition, particularly given the Chinese overcapacity problem. And then finally, in the Draghi report, but particularly in the agenda of the Commission itself, the idea of using procurement much more aggressively to basically promote European goods. So this is the Buy European agenda of the so-called Clean Industrial Deal. Okay, so what are the problems with this new agenda? So I think you can distinguish between some problems with the approach and some problems with the implementation. So the problems with the approach are the general problem that subsidies may basically help incumbents reduce competition and slow structural change and needed adjustment. So the big example is in the energy-intensive industry. So this is clearly something that is mostly driven by big incumbents. It's supposed to mostly help big incumbents. And then it has one really problematic side effect, which is it could slow needed reduction of or outsourcing of energy-intensive production stages from Europe, right? So we all want to maintain a leadership in energy-intensive industry. On the other hand, we have to realize that we are not an energy-rich continent, and we will not be even after the green transition is successfully completed, because we are relatively structurally poor in renewable energy sources. And so to, basically just try to keep as much of this industry alive and in Europe as possible is a problem, because this industry might not emerge as competitive even after the energy transition is through. And the chances that the industry might survive might increase if certain energy-intensive production phases are in fact allowed to move either within Europe to countries, areas where there's more sun, or outside Europe. The issue of energy prices is directly related to that, right? So you can reduce energy prices in two ways. One is by expanding supply. The other one is by shifting demand out of Europe in the production phases where we do not have a comparative advantage. And this is a problem that's simply not reflected either in the Commission's strategies or actually in the Draghi report itself. The second big problem is what we have not really thought through how we are going to reconcile this, what I call defensive economic nationalism. So, embracing some degree of protection for industries that we do not want to be wiped out, with our desire to maintain an open international order, right? It's very clear that as Europe, we are more dependent on international trade, on the ability to import cheaply than any other advanced country region. The US is, self-sufficient to a much greater degree than we are. How do we square those things? So it is, correct to say that we probably need to be more defensive, given the way China and the US are behaving, than we were in the past. But where does it end? What is the perimeter? Can we ring fence economic nationalism here in a way that preserves some commitment to multilateralism? Again, this is not something that you see discussed anywhere in the Commission documents, and even the Draghi report really avoids the topic. So these are the problems of principle. And then we have some problems in implementation. So the main big problem of implementation is that, in Draghi's vision, we should undertake industrial policy and public investment centrally, so that competition is preserved within the European Union using central funds. And these central funds are nowhere to be seen, right? So the Commission has proposed a very modest expansion of the EU budget, which is being rejected by certainly my country, Germany. And the idea of having new EU-level borrowing, even for very specific purposes like defense or cross-border infrastructure, has been rejected. And so how do you implement that Draghi agenda without these central funds? The answer is you do it by loosening state aid rules. So you give member states greater scope to subsidize. And that is a huge problem because it violates a central tenet of of the single market. The second big problem of implementation is that it is great that the Commission is focusing more on deregulation, but it's not really focusing on better regulation at this point. So there is a little bit of a haphazard approach in undoing some of the regulatory excesses of the last 5 years in a way that procedurally repeats many of the mistakes of the excesses, in the sense that it doesn't actually conduct a thorough cost-benefit analysis. And this has just blown up in the form of the so-called Omnibus 1 bill, which was a very reasonable bill in the sense that it wanted to lower disclosure burdens associated with sustainability reporting, which were weighing on many firms and banks also. But it did it really without rethinking the underlying regulation in a way that it effectively just pushed out the timing with which these things would come into effect and exempted large parts of SMEs from these requirements. It seemed a very ad hoc solution, and so it was rejected by the European Parliament, and they're now being sent back to the drawing board. And then the final and perhaps biggest problem is that, notwithstanding the urgency of the situation, the appetite for collective action by member states remains very limited, right? So if you ask, in what sense was the Draghi report a revolutionary report, and I believe it was in 2 ways. One is it did really take us away from the traditional liberal paradigm, and the fact that a centrist policymaker who is, very much an economic liberal in the way that he has been trained in thinking, did this, shows how far we have come in the EU. So it was a revolutionary in that sense, but it was primarily revolutionary in that basically Draghi is yelling at everyone and saying, okay, get your act together and more common action, right? So we are not really seeing this common action very much. We're seeing it in some areas. Capital Markets Union might be one, thanks to also pushing by the ECB, but in things like energy markets that involve distributional effects where some countries possibly stand to lose, that are technically complicated, we don't see it very much. So let me stop here now. I end at a bad point because, the next would have been, how could we do better? So I'll leave you in suspense, okay? But this is sort of my introductory overview.
Governor Kocher, please.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here on this podium. I'm looking forward to a very intense discussion, and I'm sure we have also something to say on how we can do better, actually, because that's usually the point where we often stop in Europe when we discuss these issues. Let me just go back a couple of years to set the scene. If you look back 5 years, I think we often underestimate the effects of the last 5 years. We have experienced within 5 years the worst health crisis since 1920 to be honest, end of 1920, the highest level of tariffs since the 1930s, which of course for an open economy like the European Union economy is more problematic than for more closed economies. We have seen the largest energy price shock since the 1970s, and of course a war in Europe that we have seen last time in the 1990s, and that all together coming within 5 years. So I think this was really a set of challenges that of course would hit every economy, and it hits the European economy even stronger than others because, of course, the exposure we had to energy dependence. Of course, a war in Europe hits Europe more than other parts of the world, and also we were not very well prepared for the pandemic and the change in trade policy. So that's the starting point. And disguised by this, I would say, dramatic events, a couple of structural changes happened that most people would have known beforehand already, but we would not discuss these structural developments because of the imminent threats and challenges. Aging is, of course, an issue that leads to higher costs of labor within the European Union. Of course, the energy dependence I already mentioned, that was unveiled through the events that unfolded in the Ukraine, the Russian aggression on Ukraine, and the war, but also, of course, some approaches by the European Commission in terms of the regulation, red tape, that probably, in retrospect, were, as you mentioned, excessive in some parts when it comes to their effects on economic growth, but also their effectiveness in reaching the goals. So we have this difficult 5 years and structural changes that would have been difficult without the additional difficulties in the last 5 years. And given that set of problems, I would say the European economy is doing quite well when you look at growth rates and the growth outlook. Although, of course, the perception is a different one. So I fully understand if there is a discomfort with potential growth and what we are seeing at the moment. And I think one of the aspects that we have to take into account is that when we talk about these difficult years, we get into some self-fulfilling, of course, pessimism that we are seeing. And part of it is, of course, given the structural problems to a certain extent also justifiable, part of it is a clear exaggeration. So when it comes to what can be done here and what are the policy what is the right policy mix, which is the topic of the panel, then of course it's pretty clear that monetary policy has limited effectiveness. There is, of course, the option to provide a monetary policy stance that supports structural reforms. But of course, monetary policy in itself cannot solve the structural problems that we are facing through the structural change. Also, fiscal policy instruments, and I'm sure you will talk more about that, will have limited effectiveness given, of course, higher levels of debt that were the consequences of these crises that we have lived through the last 5 years. So it will be difficult, of course, through fiscal policy alone to make adjustments that would lead to higher growth path and to more sustainable growth. So that means there must be structural reforms. And what we are seeing is, of course, the struggle for these structural reforms. There is, of course, a huge agreement on what is necessary to achieve. The reports are pretty straightforward. I mean, not everybody agrees. But if you take the Letter report and the Draghi report and take out the overlaps, I think we are having a pretty clear picture of what is necessary. And then, of course, there's lots of other scientific studies that give us a blueprint of the necessary reforms. But it is difficult to implement. The Draghi report is implemented partially. 11% was, I think, the counting in September, beginning of October, of what has been implemented. Now again, you can either see the glass half full or half empty. 11% is not nothing, but assuming that's probably the easiest 11% to be implemented, if we keep on that pace, it will be good, but it's probably difficult to keep on the pace over 4 years of the European Commission and to achieve almost 50% of the Draghi report implementation. I'm pretty convinced that there is two things I think that are important, and then I'll talk a bit about how this can be implemented. First of all, we have been focusing a lot on these challenges and on the cost side, and not enough on the productivity side. The cost side is important, and clearly we have a cost disadvantage that we have experienced over the last couple of years and that have aggravated through some of the structural changes. But we don't look enough on the productivity side. The productivity side is clearly compensating for the cost side. Europe, the European Union, in my opinion, has to strive to make structural reforms that enable higher levels of growth. And that includes, of course, capital market union, that includes a less fragmented European Union, a less fragmented internal market, that includes, of course, also more cooperation within the European Union, and lots of other measures. But but it's probably easier, of course, also to convey to the public that it would be important to unleash these potentials that are positively seen by most of the population, than only focus on the cost side. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, if we want to achieve that, if we want to be more productive, if we want to be more agile, if we want to provide more opportunities for companies, I think the Capital Markets Union or the Savings and Investments Union is a key project, because it is an old project, but if we don't mobilize more private capital, will not be able to actually achieve higher productivity levels. But even worse so, we will not be able to achieve targets that are important to politics, such as the energy transition and also climate neutrality within Europe. And a couple of other issues like infrastructure, infrastructure investments that we need. I think it is important to say frankly, that we need both public investments but also private investments, and mobilizing private capital will be the key to achieve these targets, but also, of course, to create higher growth levels. Let me use the last 1 or 2 minutes to talk about the methods, how we can move forward. And I think there's 2, not easy, but perhaps easier implementable solutions than the discussions we have about institutional reform on the European Union level. One is, I think we need to accept that we have to move forward for some projects in a coalition of the willing within the European Union, and not for all 27 member states. I'm more and more convinced that this is the way forward. And actually, the successful projects of the past, the introduction of the euro, the Schengen area, they all were actually a coalition of the willing, and they would draw more and more member states into themselves by the power of the example. And I'm pretty sure that for some of the projects that are on the agenda of the European Commission, the larger projects, we have to use the same approach, a coalition of the willing that is moving forward as a subset of the number of member states. And the second thing is a 28th regime, competition among different regimes. It's in the letter report, in the Draghi report, for those companies that grow quickly or that would expand quickly and that operate within the European Union area, in the entire area. A carpenter in the Tyrol Valley will not need that setup for its operation. But startups, scale-ups, or large companies that operate over all borders, they would need a 28th regime. And that could start out small, but over time you could add to that regime and add more and more policy areas to make it more effective and to make it an attractive alternative to national legislative frameworks. These are 2 examples only. I think there are more, but I just wanted to say it out at the beginning so that we can discuss later on. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. Maybe I'll start by saying that within these very difficult times in international relations, politics and concerning politics and economics, in the time where unilateralism and sort of rule of the jungle is dominating international relations, Europe, I think, should stand clear for being an advocate of multilateralism, the rule of law, norms, and of course also negotiations and cooperations. And I think Europe should be more self-confident in this way of looking at things. I think that Europe still has the superior economic model. Europe has the superior social model. Europe has the superior climate model in the end. So we should be more self-confident in this area. And of course also in economics terms. I mean, we are discussing international trade, wars and so on. But the most important trading partner of Europe is Europe. So 80% of goods and services produced in Europe are consumed within the European single market. So we have a strong economic model and we should be more self-confident in this way. But of course, this model needs reform and modernization, and from my point of view, the Draghi report and the Letta report could be sort of blueprints for this modernization and reform of the European model. I wanted to have only 2 words on deepening of the single market, because from a fiscal policy perspective, I want to go to investment and public goods in the end. But concerning deepening of the single market, I think Martin has mentioned already the Savings Investment Union, and step by step we are going forward in this area. But it's very important from a European point of view, I think, that especially concerning the financial markets, we are simplifying rules. We are not deregulating rules. That's very important, I think, because we have to learn our lessons from financial crisis. We need no deregulation of financial markets. In the end, we need simplification, maybe, but no deregulation. Second thing is concerning deepening of the single market in the areas of goods and maybe also services. There's this interesting analysis from the IMF saying that, I don't remember, the tariff on goods, the internal tariffs on goods are 40% or something like that, and in the service sector even 90 or 100% or even more. And of course we are discussing this also in Austria, especially concerning these territorial trade barriers which lead to higher prices in Austria. So we are very much in favor of this bringing these internal tariffs down. Concerning, well, maybe I start with saying that I agree completely with Martin that it's not the European way and not the way of highly developed countries to discuss all day long on costs. We have to discuss on productivity. That was the Austrian story of success in the past. Accept that especially labor costs and social costs are rather high, but increased productivity and therefore unit wage costs in this area then at the end are helpful. So productivity strategy is needed, and I think that in Austria our productivity council, and I think the next report will be published in 2 or 3 weeks' time. You have to correct me. But I'm relying now on the last report, on the 24 report, so I don't know what is in the new report. But the last report focused for Austria, and I think that could be also sort of blueprint for the whole EU. The last report focused on, let's say, cheap electricity. I bring it down to the basics. The report is more than 200 pages, but only 3 headlines. Cheap electricity, because that's the basis for keeping up at least Austria as a country of manufacturing and allowing the transformation of our manufacturing industry into the future. Second thing, digitalization and all these things. And third things, third point, new structural reforms on the labor market, especially bringing people from low productivity jobs, and that's 15% of the Austrian dependent employees, 15% at the low productivity area, into high productivity jobs. So that's a whole new reform of our labor market policy is needed if you want to do that. So I think for gaining all these structural reforms, electricity prices, digitalization, reforms in the labor market, investment is key. And I want just shortly to point on a new study from the from the Vienna Institute of International Economic Studies by Philipp Heinberger and Kara Dabrowski, published this year, with the title Achieving Geo-Economic Goals by Boosting the Economy Without Raising the Public Debt Ratio, New Evidence on the Effects effects of public investment in the European Union. And this study clearly says that expansionary public investment shocks in the EU have positive macroeconomic effects, boost output, reduce unemployment, and do not crowd out private investment or harm debt sustainability. So I think public investment is key for structural reforms, and therefore fiscal policy is also key for structural reforms. And I think that is very well in line with Draghi report, with the Draghi report, because Draghi says that the EU has to scale up investment by about 1% of GDP per year. And this is achievable, I think, if it's done efficiently, well-targeted projects in infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, especially R&D, education qualification, and other areas. So that leads me to the discussion concerning the new EU budget, or the MFF, which we are discussing at the moment. And there I found this recent Bruegel report by Solt Davash and others very instructive, saying that the EU, or the new EU budget should focus on European public goods. And we need a very intense discussion. What are the important European public goods? Personally, I think, and the study also says that it's going by way farther than the actual European budget. And but we need this discussion. What are the public goods? What should we provide at the European level? What should go to the national level? But it's clear that European public goods are like climate action, research, competitiveness, cross-border infrastructure, security. Maybe all these things have to be discussed in the new EU budget. The MFF blueprint from the Commission proposes new EU revenue sources, so this own resources debate. And I have to say, I'm very much in favor of this proposal by the European Commission, because I don't see any other way out of the problem that on the one hand we need stronger Europe, and therefore maybe also more investment at the European level, or for sure more investment at the European level. On the other hand, we have budget consolidation needs at the national level. And of course, from an Austrian point of view, it's hard to say we are bringing fiscal deficit down from 5.8% of GDP without any measures this year in Austria to 3% in 2028, which we'll try to achieve, so half the public deficit. On the other hand, we should invest more in Europe. So we need these own resources at the European level. Of course, the problem, and Jerome discussed that also partly, is when we discuss own resources at the ECOFIN level. Every finance minister will say, okay, out of these 5 points, I'm in favor of point 2, 3, and of point 5. And the other one says, I'm in favor of point 1, but point 2 is completely out of any discussion, and so on. That's the problem in our discussions at the ECOFIN meetings. But in the end, I think we have to discuss these things as a package. So there is a package of 5 proposals, or maybe they will be 6 in the end, whatever. And we should discuss this as a package, and then argue that getting new own resources at the European level allows for a better let's say, budget policy at the European level without harming national budgets. So maybe I stop here, because in the end, my argument is we need a stronger Europe in these times of geopolitical tensions. Stronger Europe from a fiscal policy point of view means to increase public investment at the European and the national level. Maybe I should add that in Austria, although we are cutting the budget deficit from nearly 6% of GDP to 3%, we are stabilizing the public investments to GDP relations at about 4% of GDP. So we try to do that also on a national level, because investment, public investment, as I just said, improves or is structural policy and improves private investment as well. So investing, public investment, and the second thing, we need an intense discussion about this European public goods question, so that we know where to invest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, let's turn to the energy sector in concrete terms. I mean, there is no shortage of energy supply in the world. Still, the prices are very high in Europe. What can be done? I mean, one of the issues is, for instance, this merit order system for electricity, which, for instance, means for Austria that we have hydropower plants which charge high prices and pay dividends in the end. So it's maybe not the purpose of public infrastructure to go in this direction. What can be done in the energy pricing?
So I'm probably not enough of an energy expert to give you a really satisfactory answer, but I think the key idea would be to reduce the system costs associated with energy. So given the endowments that we have, we can reduce prices by exploiting more comparative advantage in energy production across the continent. And you do that through trade, effectively, within the continent. So that is a way of reducing prices. And it also has the advantage that you can better deal with volatility, and particularly with the cardinal problem of intermittency of renewable energy. So this is one of the areas, I think, where the gains of having a truly common electricity market would be the largest in terms of the impact. Then the issue that you raised, whether the market structure itself and the pricing structure, which is effectively focused on guaranteeing static efficiency, right? So merit order means that you will never have a shortage of electricity, because the last source of energy that you need to satisfy demand will always be paid the marginal price that it requires. And then, of course, the problem with that is that energy sources that require less to be produced, that they will be in quote-unquote overpaid. And, you know, the traditional thinking here is that that is okay, because that generates an incentive for high investment. And of course, the energy sources that are typically overpaid are the renewables that can produce at much lower marginal cost. So it doesn't always work, in the sense that you get very volatile prices depending on whether what is the marginal technology. But presumably, the more you can do storage and the more you can do cross-border trading, the less of a problem that is. So I don't know whether there is a way of organizing this market that would reduce these infra-marginal profits and reduce marginal prices without having a whole lot of unintended consequences.
Maybe a second question on the issue of deregulation. I think the Commission is completely underestimating the cost of reporting for the companies. I mean, I'm on the board of some supervisory boards, and if you see the internal effort which is needed really to fulfill all these requirements, I think is enormous. And the ombuds package doesn't really address this, because if I ask auditors at the moment, they say not much will change. Maybe good news for them, but not really for the reporting companies. So how can the... Yes, I mean, you cannot speak for the Commission, of course, but how can this awareness about the amount of burden we are producing in Europe be, let's say, increased?
I mean, I can only tell you how one would get there in principle. I mean, you need to actually review what information you're asking for, right? But I think that at least Omnibus 1 did not do that. It basically said, okay, there are those companies that have already started being covered by those reporting requirements. That will remain. Then we will postpone the extension of the same reporting requirements to the next batch, and then we will permanently take out SMEs. And I think this type of approach might be justifiable if it is very clearly an interim arrangement on the way to a more comprehensive solution where you actually rethink the benefits and costs of reporting burdens, but I don't think it was convincing as a solution in itself. And this is how it was presented, unfortunately.
Mr. Kocher, we mentioned already the issue of deregulation, yeah? And I mean, are you concerned that the US is going very much now in the deregulation mood? And we, for the financial sector, as the minister has said already, we need to keep stricter regulation for banks, for instance. Do you see a tension there? How can this be resolved?
That's a no, it works. That's a very interesting question. It's difficult to say for the moment in which direction the US is heading. We were both at the IMF and the World Bank annual meeting in autumn, and I had many talks with supervisors, with banks and so on in the context of these meetings. And one of the topics we always discussed was deregulation in the US. Whether the US administration wants to deregulate on a broad basis or not. And the answers were quite diverse. Some experts would expect a strong deregulation exercise in the US in financial markets. I'm talking in financial markets and financial intermediaries and so on. And others would say they are going to do something, but it will be a mild deregulation and not a huge change to what we have in terms of international rules, Basel III and other international rules for the regulation of the financial sector. So we'll see what's going to happen. My personal expectation is that there will be something in the US. My personal expectation is that it will have an effect on financial market stabilities in the medium and long term. And that's something, of course, that's relevant for the European Union as well. It's clear that the European Union has been served very well with the stricter regulation in terms of the regulation that has been introduced after the financial crisis. And again, here we have to distinguish between two sets. One is regulation that makes the market resilient and that creates trust and credibility for all the players on the market, and regulation that might only lead to reporting duties and to red tape that is not really used for supervisory objectives. And I think that distinction is exactly the distinction between deregulation and simplification. And I think we have to make an effort to simplify the rules, also for financial markets. There is, and now you can discuss the amount, is it 10%, 20%, 30% of the burden? There is a set of regulations that is probably not necessary for the resilience of the markets and for the stability of the markets. But this is a fine line, and it's important to keep this framework stable and resilient. From last sentence for myself, it's also important to look not only at the stock of regulation, and that's exactly what the simplification is about, but the flow of regulation. And we'll have a lot of innovation that will hit the financial markets soon. It's digital currencies, stable coins, other forms of payments, payment solutions, and all of them will require a certain set of rules. So we're going to have more rules for sure. And I think it's very important to look at this flow of regulation and to make sure that it is not adding to whatever the 60,000 pages we have in the Basel framework. So we have to get rid of things that are superfluous. We have to make sure that there's not too much coming in, but we have to make sure that what we have is creating a credible, trustworthy and stable financial market and financial framework.
Maybe on this issue of stricter regulation for banks, clearly one of the effects was that the non-banking sector has grown tremendously, and at the same time this non-banking sector is very much linked to the banking sector. Are you concerned about these developments?
So non-banking financial institutions, that's the set of institutions from mutual funds over pension funds to the darker sides of financial markets. So it's always it's important, I think, to distinguish. The ECB has a pretty clear approach, and I share that approach. We should actually target regulation to the activities and not to the institutional frameworks. So whether somebody or some institution is a bank or not is not so relevant. Important is what are the activities, the services provided, and the same service should be subject to the same set of regulation and supervisory duties or supervisory activities. That's not always possible, so that's of course an ideal setup, but I think we have to get there. And parts of the non-banking financial institutions provide very important services, and there might be some necessities for a bit more regulation here, but it's important not to crowd out any kind of innovation that we are seeing, and this is a balance. This is a trade-off that's not easy to navigate, but I think that will be important in the future. It's also important, that's my last point, for macroprudential supervision and activities. We have seen, and that's something to keep in mind, that more and more of treasury bills have been bought over the last couple of years by non-banking financial institutions. So the central banks have sold worldwide parts of their holdings that they acquired through quantitative easing. The banks have not acquired more or not much more treasury bills worldwide. It's the non-banking financial institutions that acquired the treasury bills. And looking at the leverage they have in terms of their assets and their liabilities is important for the future to make sure that we don't create a situation where there is perhaps excess leverage of these non-banking financial institutions. So having a look at that and supervising exactly that aspect will be important for the next 10 years, I would say.
Thank you. Markus, what can be done to prevent European companies from investing a lot, but elsewhere outside Europe? I mean, we have a number of companies here in Austria also which are moving their headquarters outside. And what can be done in this respect?
Maybe I'm allowed to have just one word on this financial regulation, because I agree completely. But let's look back after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, we had these higher capital requirements for banks. And banks really had to be forced to increase their capital requirements. But the outcome was, of course, that it was very successful. Banks profited a lot from these higher capital requirements, and now they are happy that they have these new standards. So I think clear standards where the industry has to accommodate to, that's a way of success. I wanted just to add that. I mean, Admati and Helwig even say, if I remember correctly, that the capital requirements for banks should be as high as for manufacturing, so 30% or something like that. So a doubling is even possibly in the long run, but that's not the point I wanted to make. Concerning the question where do companies invest and how could we improve investment within the European Union or within Austria. In the end, investment is dependent on on capacity utilization. So the most important thing for getting higher investment is to increase economic growth, to improve business cycles, and then, of course, the investment cycle will start again. That's not the position we are within now in Austria. The recession is over and economy grows, but still capacity utilization is rather low in in comparison to long-term average, and therefore this investment cycle and the upswing didn't start. So maybe I'm a bit more traditional macroeconomist in this question. I don't think that tax rates are of any importance to investment in the end. So Austria lowered the corporate tax rates from 25% to 23%, from my point of view, with no effect on investment, but with a negative effect for the budget, of course. We are missing 1 billion euro due to this decision. So I think it's a question of capacity utilization and expectations in the end. So investing more into Europe, improving Europe, getting a stronger economy in Europe, that's the way to improve investment, company investment from my point of view. But as I tried to say earlier, public investment does not crowd out, but crowds in private investment, and therefore maybe fiscal policy, which are much more reorientation to investment, an investment agenda, productivity agenda, could improve also private investment.
If there are no more reactions, maybe to each other, we could open the floor to more questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the discussion here. I'm not going to talk about degrowth anymore, but I talk about more traditional economics. And I'm a great fan of Leder's report for strengthening the single market. And I just want to mention this one or two numbers. Europe exports about 15 to 18% of its product into third countries. And the United States exports about 11 to 12%. So one of the Draghi things talks about competitiveness vis-à-vis third countries. But if Europe made stronger efforts to trade within the single market, it would not have some of these problems which we do have. So it's just an idea to maybe try to deflect some of the trade flows within Europe, but at least create value chains. The second point is about the energy thing. And Jeromin said, rightly, I think, that the merit order system is such that every demander will be assured that his supply will be fulfilled because of this system. As a political economist, I say we cannot just look at the supply of energy, but we also have to look at the demand side of energy. And there is, of course, a question whether some of the energy demand required, for instance, by the mining of Bitcoin, we know that, by what artificial intelligence requires, really serves a social purpose. And whether there shouldn't be some restrictions on some of these demanders, because obviously it is impossible to fulfill anybody and even crazy demands for energy. And energy is a scarce product. And of course, some of these energy demands for some of these non-socially valuable activities crowd out the energy we need for more productive energy uses.
Maybe just to mention, Kurt Bayer was one of the founding fathers of the Bruegel Institute, because 20 years ago he was working at the Ministry of Finance. And Austria was supporting the establishment of the Institute very early. Paul?
Yes, Paul Schmidt from the Austrian Society for European Politics. Three very quick questions, if I may. The first one to Markus. I'm glad to hear that you are a fan of European own resources, because they reduce the burden on the national contributions to the EU budget. Where do you see possible consensus regarding the own resource discussion? A question to Martin. I think it's very important what you have said, that we should be talking much more about simplification than deregulation and more targeted set of rules. My question would be to something that you have also said on the coalition of the willing. Where do you see areas where this coalition of the willing could advance EU integration now and make it more effective in the implementation of the proposals of the Draghi report? And to Jeremy, a question. Martin has mentioned that around 11% plus minus of the proposals of the Draghi report have been implemented so far. So where do you see the next 11% and what's the time horizon? Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Weibel, University of Vienna. I have a question on the energy union. Jeremy, you mentioned the importance of making sure that there is less volatility in the energy union. And that relates to the more general challenge, I think, of making sure that there is joint political action, which you noted is a great difficulty when it comes to implementing the Draghi report. So interconnectors, electricity interconnectors in Europe, including inside the European Union, if we think about France and Spain, for example, or also between members of the European Union and non-member states such as Norway, which is energy rich, and the United Kingdom, are crucially important in this respect. But they have also become politically very salient. For example, following the blackout on the Iberian Peninsula, in April 2025, they've been a major issue in the Norwegian election this year. And electricity interconnectors are very vulnerable to be damaged in accidents or in sabotage if they're undersea cables. So how can we overcome these concerns that particular European states might have about integrating their electricity grids further, including through electricity interconnectors? Thank you.
Jürgen Janger from the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. The question today is, what is the right mix of structural, monetary and fiscal instruments? I think the more interesting question is actually, what is the right level of structural, monetary and fiscal instruments? For the monetary instrument, that's clear. We are already at the European level. But I think the Draghi report makes it clear that in many critical areas, it would be better to either move competences to the European level or at least to do stuff together like common purchases or common coalitions of the willing, for example. Now my question is, would you agree with that? And how far do you see member states willing to engage in this? Particular, maybe Markus Marterbauer, you already mentioned your experience of the ECOFIN. I mean, in certain areas, it is so clear that a more European level actions would be so much more productive. For example, research. The European Research Council in basic research works really well. Now there's the European Innovation Council. It doesn't have enough budget. To have more budget, member states would have to give some of their budgets to the European Innovation Council. Are we ready for this? What is your view on this? Thank you.
Franz Nauschnig, formerly ÖNB, now European Task Force Carbon Pricing. My question is related to this energy union question and prices of energy. One of the biggest problems we have in Europe is we do not have electricity grids to connect Europe sufficiently. We need huge investments in electricity grids. and with investments, if done privately, are very, very costly and drive up the price of electricity. For example, in Austria, around 1/3 of electricity costs is the network costs. If we can use a cheaper financing source for this electricity grids, we can do a lot, making electricity cheaper and connecting Europe. And Chairman, we had at the Fratscher Commission a discussion how to finance infrastructure more cheaply, and the Austrian ASFINAG model with a state guarantee allowed much cheaper financing than public-private partnerships or even private partnerships. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, Rainer Münz. I wanted to hint at some of the problems that hinder us to get beyond the 11%. When you look at particularly the letter report, you see the, unachieved dimension of the European single market in services has to do with the fact that we have a fragmentation of these markets which are related to local oligopolies or monopolies. For example, there is no need to have, 150 European telephone companies, when in the US it's maybe 3 to 5. Or you can say the same with energy, in the energy sector. But just start with Austria. Why does every province of Austria except Burgenland have its own energy company? So I it's owned by EVN, you know. Okay, I'm sorry. EVN is having your gas. Anyhow, forget it. Make it 9. It's even worse, right? So I think we need to understand that kind of reform would deprive certain parts of Europe of revenues, because the efficiency would lower the price, but it would also mean that some of this revenue would stay in the pockets of the consumer. And I think that's something that we see across Europe, and this is why I see an impediment that hinders the completion of the single market. You would have to compensate either or make savings in the public coffer in order to make up for that. In a situation where we think we cannot lose, that kind of income, as you, have just hinted at when looking at the taxes on corporate earnings. So I think one would have to tackle that, and the Draghi, the letter report is not talking about it. Yeah, what that kind of obstacle. It's interesting that it avoids exactly these areas where governments are still holding assets, which is telecoms, which is banks, which is energy suppliers, just to name 3 of them. Unfortunately, our railways are not making huge profits, but otherwise, this would also be an area where you could say transnational networks would make more sense that can be serviced by companies running across international borders. We have a few counterexamples, but still, as we know, it's a problem there. Okay, this would be, it's not a question, it's a remark, but the question is where would the money come from that the public coffer would be losing by opening up these single markets? Yeah? Or you can also say about private monopolies. So think why are you not allowed to own more than 3 pharmacies, for example, in Austria? Why? Just to give you a few examples where there's a lot more that could be done when you open market, but there's still people who would lose, yeah, right? Okay.
Markus, anything you want to mention or take from the questions?
Yes, as I have to leave in 2 or 3 minutes, I just wanted to focus on this question from Paul and from Jürgen. Then, so where's the consensus coming from in concerning the own resources discussion? I mean, I'm at the ECOFIN Council only for 8 months now, but my experience is that in every discussion we are starting from our speaking notes, and the speaking notes are coming from a national perspective, and that's the problem. So I pointed out this discussion at the question of own resources. Everybody starts from the national perspective, and we need a discussion, especially from a small country's perspective. So also we need a discussion that we should start from a European perspective. And I know several ministers of finance who are ready to have this European perspective, and therefore I'm in favor of this consensus or package approach, as I said, concerning the own resources question. So it's the proposal of the European Commission. Can we take it as a package or not? That would be my perspective. I know that will be no success in the end, but it will be a start of maybe a new perspective at this European level. The same is, of course, true for the European public goods question, because of course also this innovation things is a question of where the European public goods, and from an economist's point of view, of course, European public goods are much more than the 1% of EU budget in the end, so we should increase that. That will not be the case maybe in the next MFF, or for sure not in the MFF, but I think it's very important to have this intense analytical discussion from an economist's point of view, and then come in with a political perspective, which maybe then has the national perspective or the European perspective. But we need this intense and analytical discussion first, and then that could result in political solutions. So I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I have an important telephone call.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I think Mrs. Köppel had a question. Ich wollte sie nicht abwürgen. Ja.
Thank you, Angela Köppel. First of all, I would also draw the attention when we are discussing energy and we are just focusing on electricity, it's still about 20% of energy consumption. So we must not forget the other energy sources we're using. The question I have, or let's say a more a comment, regulation has been addressed several times here at the podium. And when it comes to sustainability, then we really need a bold step to implement new technologies and to scale up technologies in the European Union. And to a certain extent, I think we should also put the focus on regulation, whether the existing regulation may be a barrier for new innovative technologies to enter the market and to provide at least a certain step towards sustainable growth, as we have it here on the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you want to react to different questions?
Should I start? There were so many questions. I'll try to react quickly. First of all, to Rainer Münz's question in terms of these national identities for companies and the fragmented markets. I completely agree, and that's one of the discussions we have very often on the European Union level. I think one thing that not everybody has fully internalized is that not only for the examples you mentioned, but for many, many more technologies that we are seeing at the moment, scalability and scale effects, scale economies are really defining what they can do. And the more that's digital solutions, that's AI, and the more scalable technologies are, the larger the markets, they need to be actually most productive or most profitable. And within the European Union, the fragmentation, of course, is an impediment to this introduction of these scalable technologies. And we have seen that over the last 30 years in digital technologies. And if we don't overcome the problem, also for private goods and services, we really are in trouble actually within the European Union. And of course, you can compensate to a certain extent in completing the internal market, in enlarging the market by the accession countries, in actually having good trade agreements with the rest of the world, but still the internal market is the growth engine, and for scalable technologies, I think we need it. Very quickly, with regard to Paul's question on the coalition of the willing, I think there's lots of examples. I mean, the Savings and Investments Union is one. There's probably lots of other examples. I think even only having this option as a viable option on the table would help sometimes to get a compromise for policies that would not otherwise get a compromise. Because if you have, it's not a threat, but it's of course an outside option that would help to get a compromise on some issues where you would otherwise not get a compromise. And lastly, to Franz's question in terms of the energy union and energy infrastructure. I myself, a couple of years ago, in an official document of the ministry, proposed an ASFINAG solution for Austria, but also for Europe in energy infrastructure investments. I think the important thing is the combination of private and public investments, and I think it would not probably be needed for the high-level networks. So if you know to what extent the large energy companies can actually finance themselves, the Verbund in Austria, others in other countries, then there's not much difference to treasury bond yields that you would have to pay. But it's a lot of smaller companies, the Landesenergieversorger, the mid-level grids. Those could profit from such a solution. But it's more, of course, a governance problem, not so much a financing problem. The financing instrument could be easily implemented. The federalism argument is a more complicated one in Austria.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Yeah, so there were many good points. I think, Paul, you asked where are the next 11% coming from? I mean, first of all, I don't think this 11% is a serious number, right? Because you would, what is the counterfactual, right? So you would, if the European Commission, the member states were doing a perfect implementation strategy, then of course even so, implementation would take time in terms of realizing this, and so I don't know whether 11% is high or low, which is a point that Martin Kocher made before. But if you ask me where are sort of the next gains that might lead someone to check the boxes on what has been done, so I would say we will probably see some progress on the capital markets union agenda, because there seems to be a sufficiently broad consensus to move ahead, notwithstanding still significant resistance. We will see something on review of merger guidelines, which goes a little bit into this fragmentation discussion, which we had here. I don't know how significant this will be, because I actually agree with Rainer that the main fragmentation barrier is not competition law. I think it is some combination of vested interests and simply local control, right? I mean, including by local authorities, like was pointed out here. It's not just national authorities. And then the one that where I'm really hopeful that something meaningful will come is the so-called 28th or 0th regime, and we will contribute to that. So I think in these areas, the Commission has promised things, and it is within its scope to come up with something more or less meaningful, provided that member states are supportive, and I think they will be to some extent. Now then the question is this going to be enough? And so I don't think these are game changers. I think the most important one is the 28th regime on these, but I can speak a little bit more about that later. there was the question by Michael Weibel on interconnectors and the political economy. So, the glib economist answer to your point, whether, a bit like in the area of financial integration, whether more integration is helpful if by integrating we can import the problems of the weakest system, so to speak, right? I remember this discussion, for example, going on in the aftermath of the Greek crisis with respect to financial integration. So maybe, the diversification aspects of integration are swamped by the contagion argument, right? This is a very fundamental point. And so the glib economist answer is that we probably will have to think about integrating the system at the same time as we are integrating how we manage buffers within the system, so capacity mechanisms, storage, and things like that, right? So you should increase the efficiency of the system, but at the same time you also have to think, collectively about efficient safety nets within the system. So that is the 30,000-foot answer. What this actually means in practice, I don't know. So this is hopefully the energy economists at Bruegel and elsewhere. I know that we have a paper coming out very soon at Bruegel that talks about coordination of capacity mechanisms across Europe, and so maybe this is part of the answer. I have a slightly more skeptical view of the own resources debate, which is also in our paper, than Minister Marta Bauer. So it is not enough. I think one cannot assume that finding new own resources in the normal definition of the word, which is that these are revenue resources that are, of course, ultimately raised nationally, but where there's an agreement that they will automatically flow into the European coffers, they do not automatically reduce the budgetary pressure or add to budgetary envelope of member states, right? And the reason is that very often these own resources, when it comes to behavioral taxes, for example, they are really, conditional transfer mechanisms from national budgets to the European budgets. They're just cleverly conditioned on things as opposed to being unconditional and just a residual, right? So it is not automatically an efficiency gain unless the behavior that you are influencing through these own resources, like, a plastic bag tax or something like that, somehow increases the resource envelope, which it normally does not, right? So I think what we have to think about is as own resources that, through the power of coordination, increase the, I would say, the tax base, or what you can reach of the tax base for the EU as a whole, right? Even then, I think there's always this issue of having achieved an extra tax revenue, why should the European budget keep it as opposed to this being redistributed back to member states? So that problem you will never avoid. But I think that, the legitimacy of own resources and the claim that they should really go into the European budget is higher if you could not have had that own resource without everyone, in some sense, moving collectively, as opposed to countries doing it on their own. Now, we have had own resources in this direction, ETS, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so resources that are really linked to collective endeavors, and still there's always a fight about how this is distributed between member states and the public. So I'm not completely sure how we can get out of there, but I do think that the main issue is, the main argument, I think, for doing more at the European level is not normally the greater efficiency of pooling on the revenue side. I think it's mostly greater efficiency on the expenditure side. But that only works if you can reliably delegate expenditure items to the European level. And that in turn requires a lot of preparation. And so for that reason, I do think that, our path-breaking report on the MFF probably comes too late. So we should think of it as a set of recommendations, perhaps not for this coming MFF, but for the next one. But this is a very long time. But I sort of had a conversation with a senior policymaker from the German Ministry of Finance, and I was told, look, we really cannot agree to an increase in the EU budget because everything that is within 5 years, which is our medium-term planning horizon, is verplant in Germany, right? So we have already completely maxed out on whatever we can pay. And so everything that is going to be creative has to be outside that horizon. Now, that is a big problem for Europe that has to act fast. So maybe one has to argue with this and challenge it. But at some level, she is right. I mean, we maybe do have to think ahead and get sort of somehow a strong commitment. A bit like when we introduce constitutional budget rules, right? We sort of do it after long transition periods, right? So maybe we have to somehow transpose that to a reorganization of the budget between member states and the European level. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't want to extend the time, cannot, but maybe for our next session, you could be a bit more concrete on what we can expect on the progress of capital markets reform. And for the time being, I would like to thank you for your proposals, for your discussion, and also the audience. Many thanks for all the good ideas we have heard. And I leave with some confidence, I must say, and would like to congratulate Bruegel again on the 20 years. So if you would have not been established 20 years ago, we would need you now at least. Thank you. Ja, ich glaube schon. Ja.
So it's, I'm not going to keep you here for very much longer because, in effect, everything has been said on this panel. So let me try and give closing remarks, not by introducing something new, because so much has covered, but in a way trying to wrap up this last session the way I would see it. So I think that on the upside, since the beginning of 2024, and particularly with the letter and the Draghi reports, we have seen a deeper reflection on what Europe needs to do than we have had in a long time. And so, there is a general awareness that what is required is a significant break, and particularly a significant breakthrough on common action, and perhaps on experimenting with some policy instruments that we have in the past rejected as overly interventionist. So this is how I would put it. What has not happened, I think, is two things. One is a sufficiently careful consideration of the trade-offs that this involves, and particularly the trade-offs between, the basics of our economic model, which has been very successful, as was mentioned, which is based on competition, integration, openness, and so forth, and the new interventionism and the need for some degree of protection or economic nationalism at the EU level. So this is sort of the elephant in the room, and you do not see this being really worked out, either in the Draghi report or in European Commission documents. As a result, things are left fuzzy, and the consequence of that is that we may either go too far or not far enough in how we push the envelope. And the other thing that we have not seen is a real sense that member states are willing to undertake that extra step in coordination and cooperation that Draghi calls for. And so why is that, given that arguably we are in the biggest economic challenge and political challenge of the post-war period? So in my view, it has to do with this particular flavor of the emergency that we are in, where we are facing significant decline and disruption, particularly countries like Germany, Austria, and Italy that are very much manufacturing based in their prosperity. But at the same time, the actions that would prevent us from declining further are not as time sensitive as the types of actions that produce the real leap forward at times like the Euro crisis, right? So common supervision is something that was done under a deadline. Or in the previous crises, the common action on energy markets was done in the face of the coming winter of 22 and the catastrophe that a breakdown of European markets would have led there. So we are lacking that sort of deadline, and as a result there is still far too less common action. So where will this lead us? So I think, the baseline expectation is that we will do more collectively, particularly on defense, but it would be largely within the boundaries set by home bias in the defense industries and by the current fragmented nature of our security efforts. We will try and reconcile European industrial interests with climate targets in a way that avoids having to say no outright to these climate targets. And we will use some of the flexibility under the new state aid rules and some of the, permissions that Draghi has given us to think more about industrial policy, to subsidize some incumbents and possibly prevent a collapse of the industry. So for me, this is very much a defensive program. It will probably deter Putin from attacking. It will prevent a complete turnaround in our approach to climate, and it will prevent possibly a short-term catastrophe. What it will not do is lead to higher growth, and neither will it lead to significantly reduced dependency from the United States, which I think at this point is really critical, given that the United States has basically stopped being the benevolent hegemon that it was in the post-war period. So what can we do beyond that? And so the important thing is, within the political economic constraints. So I'm not going to sit here or stand here like Draghi in his Brussels speech in September and say, you need to finally get it. He has already said that, right? Yes, we need to finally get it. But can one do more within the perimeter of what in principle has already been accepted? And so let me sort of roll down the list of what I think is in principle feasible with better leadership, both nationally and at the Commission level, and with a greater willingness to think through trade-offs. Number one, a return to better regulation principles. So I do think it's, just saying we need to deregulate is not going to cut it. We are going to be going from one extreme to the other, but we need to focus on getting the institutional and organizational approach to regulation right. And in principle, there is a set of tools that the Union invented 10 years ago that has to do with doing serious cost-benefit analysis that is out there. We need to bring that back. Second, we do, I think, have to face up that we will need some extra degree of industrial policy, but it needs to be more focused than what we have seen both in Commission documents and the Draghi report. And particularly, it should not assume that all energy-intensive industry is automatically worth subsidizing, so long as it is also greening. Third, we probably need to build institutional frameworks around industrial policy that allow greater use of discretions, right? So this goes ultimately, and here, Kurt and I both worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and there you can see that, discretionary decisions on what to fund can work if you have a process around it of accountability that prevents big mistakes from being made. But you have to allow the discretionary judgment to happen. You cannot automatically say some industries are just good and worth subsidizing per se. And so this is what effectively motivates this European DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, idea as an institution that can spot opportunities and make investments based on high-level principles of what it pursues, what objectives it pursues, rather than specific technologies that are preordained, as is the case now in things like the Net Zero Industry Act. Fourth, very important, we need a strategy to reconcile protection from Chinese overcapacity with multilateral trade rules, right? That's basically the holy grail. So at this point, I, as a dyed-in-the-wool free trader, I'm convinced that we will need to some degree of protection for the simple reason that I do not think that China will be the cheap manufacturing powerhouse of the world forever. If that were the true, then yes, we should specialize in services and just, charge them incredibly high prices for visiting the Kunsthistorisches Museum here in Vienna and other things, but it will not be the case. There's a macroeconomic, a distortive element to Chinese overcapacity, which will disappear over time. So overcapacity will be reduced because there will be a market fallout and because demand will rise, domestic demand in China, so that the bigger than neighbor policy, which is overcapacity, will be reduced. And by the time we get there in 10 years, we still need to have some industry left. And so I think that will justify some protection, but we have to do it in the least distortive and most competition-friendly way possible, and it needs to be reversible. And on how to engage this, we have not talked. I think it has to be through trade policy primarily. It cannot be through subsidies, because if we are doing it through subsidies, again, we have to identify particular incumbents that we give these subsidies to, and that is basically at the beginning of the end. But we have to do it in a way where we can still credibly defend multilateral trade rules, so probably through safeguards rather than other instruments. We will need common capital market supervision. I think that is the most realistic, concrete thing on CMU that we have on the plate. Importantly, though, I think the execution of capital markets supervision and can be decentralized, and local financial centers can retain some specialization. So I do not think that CMU will succeed if this is just viewed, particularly by the smaller countries that now do a lot of business in capital markets, as a power grab from Paris. So we need to basically give these countries a significant share of the activity, but we need to centralize the governance structure. We will need to create a joint EU electricity market, which addresses some of these interconnectors problems, at least within a coalition of the willing, like Governor Kocher was saying. We will need a new push on reducing services market barriers. So there's clearly an enforcement deficit. We have documented this in a Bruegel paper in July, but it may also require new legislation in areas that have not been harmonized. Then there's the 20 years of zero regime for young or smaller firms. So this is on the Commission agenda. I'm just hoping that member states will not pick this apart, and that it will be meaningful, and that it will include things like labor market legislation or labor legislation, and not just product markets. We need much greater coordination of national energy and climate plans, with some means to compensate the losers. We need, in my view, and I think here I may be aligned with your Minister of Finance, probably will need another revision of the fiscal rules to make them investment friendlier. So they're not very public investment friendly, and I think you can do that by, in effect, giving countries more room to borrow for the purposes of spending on temporary public investment programs, provided they undertake the fiscal adjustment that is needed to repay that extra debt at the same time, right? But since that underlying fiscal adjustment is temporary, you only need a relatively small adjustment in the non-investment budget to, since the fiscal adjustment in the non-investment budget is permanent, whereas the investment that you need to finance is temporary, this is a relatively small effort. So we have written about this. We called it sort of a investment-friendly, fiscally responsible golden rule of some type. It's super difficult, and I'm going to end on this, and this is so controversial in this part of Europe that I mentioned it after your finance minister has left, is the euro safe asset, right? So I do think we need to think very seriously about this for capital market development purposes, but also just as a source of common financing. And at the very least, I think we need to think about three things: rolling over NGEU debt. So I do not think it really makes sense to try and repay the little bit of common EU debt that we have now, that is potentially the core of a safe debt that might make us attractive for international investors. To pay this down and make it disappear as fast as possible is not a great idea. And if we do not do that, it would also help create fiscal room for other spending items. We probably need to think about synthetic safe assets. So this is the idea that you can pool national debt, and the diversification would make it safer. So this is too big to now think through that, but there were proposals about 10 years ago in this direction, some of which I think should be revisited. And then finally, yes, I do think we need new EU debt for joint assets and spending involving clear efficiency gains. So the EU debt has a bad reputation, and primarily it is because of the moral hazard problem, that we raise common funds and then we give it to individual countries. They can do with it more or less what we want. I don't think we can go down this road again, but we can go down the road of financing genuine common EU expenditures that are decided centrally, or indeed common assets like common defense relevant assets. And if that's indeed in common control, then you can justify joint debt creation. So basically, I see a long list of items that are in some sense Draghi report adjacent, but that haven't completely been nailed down. I mean, a lot of it, of course, in the Draghi report has been nailed down, should be implemented. So I'm not discussing that, but what I'm discussing is those items that do involve these trade-offs that we haven't really faced up to. And so here, the one critique I have of the European Commission is that it does not make the trade-offs clear in its documents, and as a result, we may get under execution of these items precisely because member states are not quite comfortable. I mean, unless we make the trade-offs clear, the danger of unintended consequences is always very high, right? So they have to be thought through to a greater degree than they have now. So this is where I would leave it, and not much really to add to the previous section, but this is where I'm often viewed as being too pessimistic, which is I guess happens to you if you live in Brussels and read too many of these documents. But this is sort of my attempt of reconciling some degree of skepticism with constructiveness. Thank you so much.